A few weeks ago, we discussed the existence and the nature of sin. Uh, then we talked about sin as a broader concept that impacts everything in the created order. We talked about the origin of sin. Well, today I'd like to take a more personal look at sin. And we started to do this last week with our readings of C.S. Lewis and the Screwtape Letters. We started to look at this whole idea of temptation in Lewis's book. But basically, we want to turn our attention today to understanding this whole concept of temptation. We want to pose a question. Why is it that you and I often want to do things that we know are offensive to God? To adequately answer that question, we need to understand certain truths about temptations. To define temptation, generally speaking, would be to define it as an enticement or an attraction brought about by arousing hope or desire. And in thinking about the truths and the stages of temptation today, I want to look at two biblical passages to help us unpack this a little bit. So first of all, we look at 1 Corinthians 10, verses 12 and 13, and Paul writes, rather, therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you, except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. And when we look at this passage, we see at least, say, 7 truths related to this whole concept of temptation. And in walking through these 7 truths, I'm going to appeal to some material that Bruce Wilkinson has written in his book called Personal Holiness in Times of Temptation. I believe the book is currently out of print, but if you can get a copy of it, it's an excellent book to define the theology of holiness and then to look specifically at this issue, this whole topic of temptation. And the book, to some degree, is written for men, but I think it's useful for a general readership. So I would encourage you to take a look at that text. I've listed it at the end of this presentation. In looking at this passage in 1 Corinthians 10, verses 12 and 13, we can see about 7 truths that emerge here. And the first is this idea that you are not immune to temptation. So it says there, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. And so Bruce Wilkinson in that text writes, temptations always minimize the real negative dangers and maximize the imagined positive benefits. And this is what we see happening in C.S. Lewis's letter, Screwtape Letters, and we see this whole concept of minimizing um, our sinfulness, minimizing the dangers of falling into temptation. Secondly, we see here in this passage that temptation wants to defeat you. It says here that temptation wants to overtake you. It wants to grab hold of you as if it's alive, and it's actively seeking to drag you down. Thirdly, we see here that everyone faces temptation. There are no new temptations, there are no new sins. They might look different today or take a different form, but at their root, all temptations are the same. The temptations we face each day are the same old ones that others before us have experienced. It's also important to notice that your temptations are not unique to you. Don't believe that yours are uniquely dangerous, that you've got it worse than some other people. Everyone faces temptation. But the good news is that God will not abandon us. It says here that God is faithful to help us during times of temptation. It says that He's with us during temptation. And I'm reminded here that even in our understanding of Christ and what He has done for us, we recognize that He came and He faced all the challenges that we faced living here as a human. And even regarding temptation. At the start of his ministry, he went out into the desert and he faced Satan and battled with him as he faced the temptations that Satan brought toward him. God will not abandon us. He's with us. He understands the things that we're going through. Furthermore, we see here that God limits the extent of temptation. He won't allow us to be tempted beyond what we're able. And it's important to notice here that that might be different from one person to another person. And Bruce Wilkinson, again in that text, has this idea of a temptability quotient. So it could be that you might have a certain level of like a threshold of temptation in a certain area, but your friend or your coworker or someone else might have a different threshold in terms of what they can handle in terms of that. That's okay. We are different, but God limits that temptation to our situation so that we'll be able to handle it. And then it says that God makes a way of escape. When you feel trapped, God has an escape route for you. And we should also note that that escape route is given in God's timing, not ours. That sometimes we feel like we're at the threshold and we don't see the escape route, but God will make it available to us when we look to Him and when the time is right. And lastly, we can have victory over temptation. And when we look at this passage, we see that God makes a way of escape so that we'll be able to bear the temptation. It's not just that we'll be able to endure it, but we'll actually be able to grow as a result of going through that temptation. And this is kind of what we read about in the Sacred Romance, and how the authors paint this idea that even though the message of the arrows is out there, and we're facing this struggle on a daily basis, that God can even take the message of the arrows and turn them into something that He weaves into the message of the Sacred Romance. And so we see that God makes a way of escape. He allows us to have victory, and He can even turn the difficulties we face into something that's very good. Well, the next thing I want to do is look at a second passage which walks us through basically 7 stages of temptation. And in James 1, verses 13 through 17, we read, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does He Himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Don't be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning." Before thinking about the stages, I think it's important to remember that, first of all, God is never the ultimate source of temptation. Instead, we read here that He is the giver of good gifts. We should also note here that the temptation itself is not sin, but its goal is to lead to sin. Let me say that again. The temptation itself is not sin, but the goal of temptation is to lead to sin. Well, to map this out a little bit, I created this diagram that might look a little cheesy, but I think it shows how the stages of temptation work. And at the bottom, it kind of lays it out, moving somewhat in a linear fashion from emotion to thought to will, and that could be somewhat debatable. But if we look at the words that are here, I think you can understand why I put those there. And when we read this passage, we see that each one is tempted, first of all, when he's drawn away. And so there's something, it could be our eyes that are gazing towards something, or our heart that's gazing towards something, and it's pulling us away. It's drawing us away, and we're being drawn away then by our own desires. And so as we're drawn away, the desire for that thing builds within us, and it says that we're enticed. And so Satan is coming at us, enticing us with that thing that is drawing us away. Perhaps our circumstances are contributing to that. There is a certain lure here to whatever is out there, and Satan is trying to use it to draw us away from God and draw us into sin. Now, it's important to notice at this point, I've got a line down the middle of the page and a note here that this is not yet sin. We're being tempted, and Satan is enticing us, but we have not yet sinned. And instead, we see here that this is the point where God intervenes. He's making a way of escape, an opportunity for escape, and we will not face something that's more than we can handle. If we don't choose to take that escape route, though, we cross over into sin. And this is where our thought and our volition, our will comes into play here, and we see sin taking birth. So it says here then, when desire has conceived, we have made the choice to act and move forward on that thing which was taking our gaze away, which was tempting us. And as soon as conception takes place, it gives birth, it says, to sin. And that is what's going to actually lead us into some kind of action, which then as that sin continues to develop in our lives, it grows to the point where eventually the result we already have seen of sin is death. And so we see the process here involving all the way from maybe a look or a gaze to a decision or a conception to death. And right in the middle there stands God's escape route for us. So I hope you've found this helpful in terms of thinking, first of all, about the truths related to temptation, and then secondly, I hope this diagram was helpful in helping you see how the stages really of temptation unfold, and how there is a critical point there where maybe we've been tempted, we haven't sinned yet, and God's made a way of escape, and we have the opportunity to take it and avoid sin. There are times, though, when if we don't take that, we cross the line, we move towards sin. If we continue in that vein, we always see that sin is this corrupting and destructive force which ultimately leads to death.